Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. I got another mug of chai tea, so we must still be talking about performance appraisals. This is lecture 17, the challenges associated with performance appraisals. Let's get going. This should be a pretty straightforward lecture. We'll probably come under time if I don't chase too many squirrels. It's pretty straightforward. So last lecture, which is the start of chapter 6, we talked about the methods, the different types of performance appraisals. So what is a performance appraisal? We talked about the aspects of performance appraisal. Talked about its purpose and various things that make it more or less effective. We talked about ratings systems. We delineated the most common rating system, which is a 1 to 5. But we also talked about other appraisal systems, things like stack ranking and those sorts of things. But today we are going to be talking about the challenges, or at least a lot of the challenges. We're certainly not going to be talking about all of them, but we'll talk about a lot of the well understood ones associated with appraising somebody's performance. For the most part of the lecture, we will be talking about bias and error. And there'll be several slides for bias and error, and we will be covering lots of biases and lots of errors that are associated with performance appraisal. And then we'll talk a little bit about what you can do to try to avoid some of those biases and errors, or at least try to mitigate them. And then we'll just sort of talk about the bottom line, sort of sum up the way most people feel about performance appraisals. All right, let's get right into it and just start rattling off bias and error in performance appraisals, and maybe a short segue. By now, you're probably used to me hammering home just the sheer complexity that the world manifests, and with humans, our limited brains, our limited are the constraints applied to the way our brains work, our bounded rationality, means we always have to reduce things and try to understand them in ways that are simplifications, reductions of the true complexity. So not only is reality way more complex than our brains can handle, humans are part of that reality, and humans are ridiculously complex. We ourselves are ridiculously complex. We can't even fully understand ourselves, so we certainly can't really fully understand another human being. And that other human being is acting in the world too, just like you. And they're trying to figure themselves out and other people, and they're also working with frameworks that are gross reductions, gross simplifications, cartoons, if you like, of the real complexity, and they're behaving according to those, according to that framework, that narrative. So you have this situation with something like a performance appraisal, where one human being, and that is the supervisor, the manager, is talking to another human being who's the one being appraised, or the employee, and trying to use words, language, which is itself a serious reduction of the complexity, to try to explain, behaviors that are good and behaviors that are bad in proper context, so that there's understanding. And I've done a lot of performance appraisals, and I've received a lot of performance appraisals, certainly at least one for every year I've been working, and I've been working quite a while. And then I have been in 25 years as in some form of leadership role, where every year or multiple times a year I've had to give lots of performance appraisals. And I just want to state from the beginning that you never fully are able to capture the richness of somebody's performance, and to try to reduce it to something like a rating of 1 to 5, with some paragraphs of explanation, sometimes feels like a gross disservice to the person you're rating. Other times it feels okay because both parties are aligned in what the rating is. Both people feel that the rating you're giving is quite fair, and that you feel like when you've written your comments, your narrative to try to sort of sum up their year, that it's been well received. Other times it's just not. So it's a very imperfect process. And we'll kind of bookend this, this opener with a closer when we get to the final slide and talk about the bottom line of performance management. But for now, let's get into all the ways that, that performance management is challenging, and just start delineating errors and biases. Okay, first bias that we want to talk about is the halo effect. And I don't know, a good fraction of these biases and errors I'm going to bring up are going to be versions of something you probably have heard of before, at least a few of them. And certainly if you were interested in paying attention in your introductory psychology class, you've heard of some of these. If you are a student, so to speak, of pop psychology or folk psychology, the kind of psychology you hear about, you know, in the media and people talk about. Biases are something that are now, generally speaking, a reasonable part of people's vocabulary. And another word you might hear is heuristic, and a heuristic is a partially or arguably fully cultural construction, but it's also a product of our constraints of our brain. You know, all the bounded rationality we talked about has a tendency to limit the ways in which our language and our concepts, which are cultural constructions, can form. So our culture is tied down, so to speak, to our bounded rationality, and so we end up with these sort of shortcuts in thinking that are often called heuristics. When they go right, you know, they're either not thought of at all, or they're thought of as yeah, just a heuristic and it works. But when they go wrong, when they are too much of a simplification, and the complexity of the situation is such that there's a mismatch, that's when they go wrong, and that's when they get called biases. So this term bias, it gets used a lot. You hear like implicit bias, which is a bias that you're not necessarily consciously aware of, or at least you're not aware of it, you know, when it's working and influencing your judgment. But you shouldn't hear this term bias and immediately think that this is some sort of genetic mechanism that no matter what, all brains are like this. There's certainly a genetic expression element to the limits of our cognition, which is to say our bounded rationality is not only a product of culture. Our bounded rationality is definitely also a product of our development, which is for sure a product of our gene expression, which is limited by our genes. So all of these nature nurture stuff, remember, are really, you know, one thing that we can't really fully understand. So there are certainly biases that emerge consistently, but there are also biases that the amount to which they emerge, or even if they exist at all, are contextually bound, which is also to say that they're culturally related. So as we go through these biases and errors, don't have it in your mind that each one of these is like a foregone genetic conclusion that all human beings have these things. These biases and errors are related to the performance appraisal process, and some of it is just inherent in the process because the process is a simplification, and some of them are potentially, you know, hardwired at their core, and have some mechanisms that may be genetically expressed, so to speak, and at some point we might be able to delineate that. But right, it's too premature to define to say that now. Anyway, that's enough of a long preamble. the halo effect. Now, the halo effect is where you make a judgment about. So these biases and effects aren't always things that just relate to people and appraisals. The halo effect can be something that you use to make a judgment, have a bias that could relate to the kind of shoes you like, depending on the circumstances. But when it is applied to people, and then all of these will be performance appraisal related, so these will be applied to people, that's where you have a tendency to form an opinion about a person based on a single attribute. And that might be, you are just a sucker for tall people, or short people, or people who went to a certain school, or they went to the same college as you, so you're just predisposed to think favorably of them. And all the ambiguous situations where you don't know how to interpret what somebody said as good or bad or neutral, you tend to interpret it and construe it as good because, this person's just the kind of person you like because, they went to the same school as you. Or vice versa, they went to a rival school, and now whenever there's ambiguity, you just kind of have a tendency to construe why it's a negative situation. So the halo effect is really the idea is that one certain attribute is so influential to you that it's like a halo is on this person. The way to get around the halo effect, besides be aware of it and make a rater, make a person doing the performance appraisal have to justify their decisions about things, so that sometimes you can't just answer if there's 10 ways in which you're assessing somebody's performance and you end it all with, and you went to the same school as me. I mean, obviously you'll catch yourself and go, oh crap, maybe I'm have the halo effect. These things tend to be subtle. People tend to think they're being objective, but one should be on watch for this. But if you have multiple people doing the rating, is a good way to mitigate it, because maybe everybody has some sort of thing that they'll be biased towards, but it's not likely that the candidate will trigger that positively for everybody. In multiple raters, it's a good way to mitigate a lot of biases, but it's also rather impractical, because most people don't have 2 supervisors or more, unless they're what's called like a matrix management organization. All right, the constant or systemic bias. A way of looking at that is if you have a systemic bias, and it could mean all sorts of things. But if you just always are biased towards a few certain things and thinking a certain way, and you've lost a lot of objectivity, and you key in on just a few things, you'll probably have a tendency to have your people have ratings that are skewed differently than other folks. And so if you have different raters, assuming you were in a situation where more than one person could observe performance, and you just see that you consistently are much lower than the group or much higher than the group, there might be something that's systemic that you need to look at. And so that's why it's good for human resources to look at what does the data say across all of the people doing performance appraisals. Are there anything that's really popping out where the way the ratings spread across their team, it seems skewed one way or another? That could be just because that person has a team of really high performers or really poor performers, or people that don't have enough experience and that their job is too complex, or whatever. That can exist, but if you see the skewed ratings, you definitely, in your human resources, you've got an obligation to investigate that, to pick that scab, so to speak, and make sure that there's good justifications for that variance. There will always be variance, and that variance will have levels to it. Not everybody's team of direct reports will have a uniform spread of high performers to low performers. There inevitably will be teams that have more high performers than low performers, and vice versa. But to make sure that that's not coming from some sort of systemic bias that you don't want, you want to be aware of it, look into it, talk to those people, and make sure that there's a good rationale for that. So that whole shifted distribution of ratings is what I was talking about, as a way that you can spot that. And then there's the recency bias, and this, like the halo effect, you may have heard of the recency, and that's really a tendency to have your last encounter be quite formative, and to sort of discount all the previous encounters. So I mean, this can take the effect at the end of a meeting. If you were talking about all sorts of stuff, the very last part of a meeting can have a lot more sway in your mind. Just like if you're listening to a long lecture, you tend to remember the beginning, you tend to remember the end better than the middle, all other things equal, unless there's something about the middle that was more salient than the beginning or the end. So the recency bias is, you can think of this as sort of like a residual memory kind of effect. It's not really that, but just as a way to figure out a metaphor for it. This would be like you're a manager or a supervisor, and you're going to do the annual performance appraisal of one of your employees, and you really think about like what that person's done this past month or this past week or the past few times you've encountered them, and if that was a really good experience, then you might end up with a higher rating. If it was a bad experience, it was a low rating. Well, if you stopped and think about the full year, or if you were properly documenting things throughout the year, you might realize that, oh, he actually, he did really come through this past week, but now that I really think about it and look at the record, that was an anomaly, and he's usually been way behind. So I need to not suffer from recency bias here and look across the average. So that should make sense to you. Recency bias is definitely a thing. One way you can try to mitigate that is not just wait to the end of the year. Quarterly mini appraisals or even monthly appraisals that are sort of unofficial, taking notes about your employees throughout the year. Whenever they do something noteworthy that's either positive or negative, put that somewhere that you can then draw upon when it's time to do the year-end performance appraisal, so you can see your own notes and not just rely on your memory, because your memory will be faulty and you'll self-select certain things, and more than just recency bias will come from that selection of particular memories. So more frequent appraisals, or at least unofficial appraisal-like summations with note-taking, is a way to mitigate that. Then there's inadequate information. This is more of an error, and that's simply where you just don't know enough about what the person does. And that can be for several reasons. One is maybe you're new in your job, and this person has only worked for you for 2 months, and you're supposed to assess their full year. Well, that's not really very fair. Or maybe because of whatever circumstances, instead of having 6 people that work for you, you've got 60. And how can you possibly know enough information? So this can be a real issue where people don't feel that their performance appraisal is at all fair. They're not bought into it. They lose trust. They don't feel good about their company. They don't feel good about you. If you're coming in and saying, I give you a 3 or whatever, or worse, you tell them that their performance needs improvement, and they got a really bad score, but you can't actually articulate why. That's a problem. So that's a big deal. And if you're a leader or a supervisor and you find yourself in this situation where you don't feel you know enough, it certainly behooves you to speak up about that and to talk to your leaders and say, hey, this is not a fair situation. I need to find out who knows more about what this person has done, and do things to try to get that information. All right, let's keep going. We've got a few slides on biases and error. The average rating error, and that's where you have a supervisor that just doesn't like to give out A's or C's. There's just always B's or maybe C's and B's. Almost never gives an A and never gives a D. Again, that's not normal to have the A, B, and C. It's usually like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever, where 5 is like the A. You'll get people that they don't want to make anybody mad, and they also don't want to have anybody get the spotlight more than anyone else, and they sort of maybe have inadequately developed sense of fairness, where their idea of fairness is like everybody gets the same rating and or close to it, and it's hard for them to move away from that. And that's a big deal, and it is a natural tendency for some people. And if you're a high performer in that team and you can just never get a really high performing rating, and there's some people that are quite mediocre or even poor performing, and and they tell you what their rating is, and it's the same as yours, that's pretty disengaging. You busted your butt. You made sacrifices, and you end up with the same rating, the same raise, maybe the same level of opportunities for a promotion based upon your performance, as somebody that you don't even respect. You don't feel good about your company, you don't feel good about your boss, you might quit. So average rating error is a real deal, and it's not. People think they're doing a kindness at some level as a leader, but what it really is weakness. It's kind of a form of light cowardice, if you will, my opinion anyway. And then there's leniency error, and this is sort of skewed one way, and that's where you may or may not love to give out top performance, but you really, really loathe upsetting anybody. You just don't want to deal with it. Maybe you don't want to deal with the inevitable baggage that comes from giving somebody poor performance. If you sit down with somebody and you give them a rating that's lower than what they think they earned, or lower than what they expect, you are often in for a ride. You are often, everybody's different, but all other things being equal, people tend to not like that, and people tend to get defensive, sometimes aggressively so, metaphorically, and they'll often challenge that rating. You call it unfair. It can become disheartened, disengaged, and to try to get them to see the rating from your perspective, to get them to accept the rating, so that they then go, okay, for last year or whatever, I didn't perform at the level you needed me to, that the organization needed me to. I understand that. I accept that. Thank you for describing what it was. I'm going to commit to doing better. I think I understand what it was that I wasn't doing right, and I know where I need to work on, and things are going to be better from now on. That's what you want to hear, but that's not usually what you hear. Sometimes, but usually what you hear is kind of a no, but but, and it takes a long time for people to accept it, and sometimes they never do. So it's not a trivial thing giving somebody a lower performance rating than they expect. And if you're a manager and you've done it a few times, it can kind of suck. And depending upon how you internalize that stress and that interpersonal conflict, it can be something you hate, and you can't sleep at night, and all sorts of stuff if that stuff really bothers you. And it actually can end up being something that affects your judgment when it's time to do performance ratings, and you just don't want to go there again. And so you'll construe a reason why your particular employee who's not doing that well actually did okay, and come up with a way to give them a C or something, so that you don't have to deal with the crap. And just understand that that's short-term thinking, and that you probably have other team members that work for you that know that person is performing poorly, and that's maybe creating a bunch of extra work for other people, and that person might be a real drag on other people's productivity and other people's engagement, and your inability to deal with it will cause them to lose respect for you, and at some level lose respect for the organization, and disengage. So dealing with poor performance directly and honestly and in a timely manner is in the best interest of everybody. It's just not always pleasant. And if you're going to become a leader or a supervisor in the future, you need to figure out how to do that properly in a way that's fair and constructive and supportive, and is your best effort to try to have a person accept the rating, and commit to doing better, and to not get super defensive and to hate you and to hate the organization and to badmouth everything and that sort of thing. That can be quite challenging depending upon the circumstance. But you've got to commit to that and not to be expedient, not to do something that is really, short term, trying to avoid pain or annoyance to get through a time period, because it'll come back and bite you. All right, so that's the leniency error. And then there's categorizing error, and you definitely see this happening. And that's where, we all kind of have buckets for people. And sometimes we compare them to people we know. Sometimes we get sort of narratives to describe a type of person. And when we talked about personality, I was stressing that personality traits are dimensions, but sometimes personalities get typed. They become a personality type. And those are really buckets, narrative buckets. And they're even more of a dimensional reduction than traits by quite a bit. And they are not very accurate, but inevitably we have a tendency to type people. And you need to be wary of that. Make sure that you aren't through either exposure to other people talking about types, or your own experience where you develop your own sort of personal taxonomy of the way people are, and you end up bucketizing people, and then you can end up seeing what you want to see for the way you've categorized people. And one example of that, is he's a real team player. Well, I'm not saying that that's not a thing you can say or a thing you can think, but be careful to make sure that you haven't created some really, really broad definition of what that is. And once you've bucketized somebody, so it's one thing to say that, Jill in this circumstance did some great things for the team, and she really put the team's success over some of her own priorities, and she was a real team player in that circumstance. That's fine, that's good. But it's gone too far if you get a narrative in your head that goes, Jill's a team player, and then you just ignore everything else that she might be doing that's not very good in terms of teaming. And so by making too strong of categorical structures, too strong of buckets, too determinative of typing, for people, you end up put people in boxes in your minds, and then you don't see the behaviors that don't meet that box. So it isn't that these behaviors are wrong to say them. It's the applying them as a sort of a fixed narrative and typing people in that way. So be careful about categorizing people. Another thing is your belief structure. What do you think about human nature? And like if there's like a fixed mindset or a growth mindset, for instance, and that's usually something you apply to yourself, but you can apply it to people too. If you're somebody that's like, people never change. This Bob has been like this, and he'll always be like that. Well, there's certainly something to say, but if somebody's manifested a consistent behavior for years, that it's perhaps much more difficult for them to change. But to lock it down and say never, and to do that sort of, again, it's a kind of categorical thinking, but it's sort of based upon whether you've hard-coded sort of axiomatically things about people, and you just have these scripts about people, and then you look for the ways people fit into that, and that's like creating your own boundaries around things, and not letting anything, not acknowledging anything that won't fit it. And then there's interpersonal affects, and this is really how you feel about another person, and maybe the biggest way this can manifest is when there is an interpersonal relationship, such as a strong friendship between a supervisor and an employee, or you can certainly have situations where people that work for you are friends, but there should be an asterisk sort of to that notion of friends, and you shouldn't conceptualize them in the same way that you consider friends in your friend group where people don't work for you. I mean, you have a responsibility as a supervisor, and the people that work for you, you have expectations of you as a leader, and there's a kind of give and take and expectations and informality between friends that actually undercuts the hierarchical nature of an employee and a leader, and you undermine yourself, and you actually put the employee in a difficult situation if you maintain the sort of exact same interpersonal relationship at the friend level that you would if you weren't their boss. You know, if you're their boss, you have you have decision rights over things that affect their lives. You know, you're giving their performance rating. You're telling other leaders what that person's like when they're considering, you know, maybe promoting that person to an opening that they might have. You know, you have a lot of influence over how their life's going to unfold because of the nature of hierarchy and authority inside organizations. Don't abuse that. And don't fail to understand the power of that. And when you're overly informal, and especially you know when you think of like friends, and if you like to joke around with your friends, and you like to poke fun both ways and give people crap, you need to be real careful about the way that's done as a leader. If you're there's a great television series called Band of Brothers about World War II, based on true people that fought in the war. And there's an interesting scene where one of the officers is I believe playing poker with some of his men that are like his sergeants and corporals and that sort of thing, I assume. And the more senior officer pulls him aside and says, "What are you doing?" And then, "Well, I'm just playing with the guys. You know, they're essentially they're friends too, you know." And he asks, "Well, what if you won? You know, don't ever take money from these people," sort of thing. It's an interesting concept, and so don't be too informal, and don't be unwilling to wear the burden that comes with the hierarchy. So this is a little bit too many squirrel chasing, too much advice and coaching for trying to keep on time. But don't be a friend to somebody that works for you, and that and don't confuse that at all with be a cold son of a bitch. Don't confuse that to mean don't be very supportive. Don't or don't be nurturing, or don't be kind. And that's not it at all. It is the degree of informality and sort of you know what when you're interacting with your friends, how you can just sort of let your guard down and have a give and take. But when you're the leader, you're representing the organization. You hold some of the employees' sort of future in your hands. They feel better about their position when you to an extent fulfill the role, and so it's a delicate balance, and every individual is a little bit different. And culturally, there's this thing called hierarchical distance. In Western cultures, we have very short hierarchical distance. We don't give typically titles. Everybody goes by first names and all that, and all that's great. But be careful about the interpersonal. And obviously, I've been only talking about friendships. So if you're talking about something that's more along the lines of the mating behavior, it's just a huge hard no. You just don't do that at all along a hierarchical relationship. So you certainly can be friendly Yeah, but you don't become really good friends. And so I've actually had here we go chasing more squirrels. But I've had people that I was friends with before I became their boss, and I've had people that I've been their boss that I then became friends with when I was no longer their boss. And when I was their boss, I was still very friendly, but the relationship has to change in order for there to be, fairness and objectivity. And if you continue to try to be their friend, and then you have to give them a performance review, or not give them the bonus they were thinking, or whatever, or give them too much work to do, it doesn't go well. So it's a balance for sure. All right, let's get going. Attribution error. That's where you're basically making a construal. There's lots of attribution errors, and there's a thing called fundamental attribution error, which is kind of neat. You can Google that if you don't remember it. But really, this is where you come up with a reason why somebody did something. So you're the one sort of creating the story as to why, and maybe this is you giving the person as an excuse for why something didn't work out that well, or maybe this is you construing a reason that makes them look bad, and you believe it either way. But be careful about attributing motive. Be careful about attributing cause for observed behavior. That behavior might be positive or negative from a performance standpoint. But if you don't know what the underlying cause or motive was, then you don't know. Don't act like you know. Don't convince yourself you know, or you're doing an attribution error. And then personality can create error. Example, the way conscientiousness pairs up between a supervisor and employee. Both, if they're lockstep together, both super conscientious, they can certainly be very biased. That each one is, a really conscientious person, and that has a really conscientious employee thinks that employee is awesome. But a really, all other things being equal, but a really conscientious boss and a low conscientious employee, that boss might think that's the laziest guy I've ever met. Or she just doesn't take her job seriously. Where that person might just might think differently, might be more innovative, might not like tedious stupid dumb things, and so there's a mismatch, and that can definitely create bias where you fail to see the other person's value because you can't see their perspective, or because you have the exact same perspective, you just think everything is simpatico and perfect. So personality is definitely a factor, and we won't get into like what a high self-monitoring thing is, and that's just another sort of framework in personality. But there has been some literature out there that shows that certain types of personalities have a tendency to rate people differently. And so if you're high in self-monitoring, which is to say that you're always metacognizing, you're always sort of hypervigilantly ruminating over why you did something, what your state is, and that sort of thing, and like always attributing causes of why you did something, you might have a tendency to extend that onto other people, and always construing reasons and excuses why people did what they do, and essentially end up being biased towards being more lenient. And then in the book, there's Randall and Sharples, 2012, that was talking about agreeableness that you should read, just like you should read all of the chapters, which I'm sure you're diligently doing. This is chapter 6. And then role conflict. That's really where you're trying to avoid conflict. You're trying to get goodwill. You just hate it if anybody's upset. And so you're just going to rate them higher than they deserve, because you want them happy, or you really just don't want them upset, and you just don't care enough either way. You might not actually be that engaged in your own job, which if that's the case, you need to find another job, because if you're a leader or a supervisor, you have an obligation. You have a ethical, moral, responsible job to do with regards to rating people, And if you're just like trying to give away high ratings because you don't want to deal with stuff, you know, you're not doing anyone any favors, especially yourself. And then there's impression management, and that goes both ways. That might be where you know, you have an employee that's just like buttering you up all the time, throwing compliments, or trying to steal the limelight, taking credit for everything. You know, they're just basically manipulating things in order to get appraised better, or you know, vice versa. You might, as a rater, want to be perceived as the generous person. You don't want to be perceived as somebody that's too hard, or maybe you do want that reputation. But either way, if your rating is really partially performative, in the sense that you're trying to create an impression, well, you're no longer actually thinking about the person's performance, and that is an error. All right, so how do you avoid these biases and errors? The first thing is training. You definitely want anyone doing performance appraisals to be aware of these biases and errors. And it doesn't mean they have to be able to rattle them off on a list, but you want to be aware that this is a very imperfect process, and that humans are prone to heuristics, to inherent biases, and they're definitely at play all the time, and you need to watch out for them, and so you need to be trained and aware of them. And it is really essential that not only that you get trained, but that there be other people in an organization, often from HR, other peer leaders, or your leader's leader, that's providing feedback, and that is at some level observing and coaching and talking to you about how you're doing your rating, and helping improve your rating process. And training is the start of that. And then experience. You know, the more time you spend doing performance, it allows corrective feedback to happen. Now, keep in mind, we just rattled off a whole lot of biases, and experience can definitely give you some bias. And you know, think for a minute about the types of biases, and what's like one that would pop up if you've had more years doing it. So there'd be a couple of them, but one might be categorization, typing people, where you know you've just sort of seen enough type of people, and you develop these scripts, and people fit them, and so you got to be careful. Experience can cut both ways, but if you're vigilant, if you're aware of bias, if you're aware of your own limitations, you can use your experience of doing performance ratings in order to get better at it. And then making sure there's a process, that your organization formalizes this. And it isn't just some totally subjective thing that each manager can do differently. And you want to reduce the amount of variation by formalizing the process. Another way, when it's possible, is to have multiple raters. I mean, the reality is there's often only one supervisor. And not always. Oftentimes the people have deliverables in all sorts of areas, and they're interacting with lots of people, and in some cases there's opportunities to have more than one rater, and there's what are called dotted line managers and that sort of thing. And then if you have a peer rating system, that of course you'd have multiple, but it's not always practical. And then of course feedback, and one thing is to actually have the people being rated, actually have the employees have a voice in the process, and so that if they feel their rating system is unfair, listen to them. If they think you as a leader are not fair, listen to them. Try to figure out how to get an honest answer, because they might not want to give you an honest answer because they might fear you hold it against them, and that's a problem. That means that there's not good trust either inherent in your organization, or perhaps you're fostering that lack of trust, and that's a bad deal. So. But figuring out how to get honest feedback is an important process for avoiding bias and error. All right, now here's the bottom line. Remember, we started this talking about a segue into it, and this is our segue out on performance management, and there's a reason and for performance appraisal. There's a reason that I'm being cheeky with my chai tea for all the performance appraisal. It sucks. Performance appraisal, generally speaking, sucks. It is. When it goes really, really well, nothing bad happens. You get through it. And in fact, that's often the way people talk about when some companies have performance appraisal that's like based upon your work anniversary. Like if you were hired a certain date, then that every year at that date or that month or whatever, you get your performance appraisal, and that means that performance appraisals are scattered throughout the year. But it's also quite common, and in fact, it's probably more common that organizations, have a time of the year, and it often corresponds with their fiscal year. Which is when the accountants roll up the year, and for weird reasons, that isn't always the calendar year, and sometimes it is the calendar year that you have performance appraisals. So it could be December, but it also could be any month of the year that might be the fiscal close. The accounting wraps up that fiscal year, which is the most common way to do it. And in which case you have like performance management season, and you'll have a hard deadline in which they all have to be done by. Anyway. It's not uncommon to have people talk about it, both the managers and the people that are being managed. And every manager has a manager, so nobody's not managed. And even CEOs have board of directors. Anyway, it's common to have people talk about getting through it. When we get to the other side of performance management, when we get through it, because it isn't like a thing that you tend to look at in any way as a net positive. You're trying to minimize the net negative, so it sucks. All right, let's talk about how it sucks. People don't like it. People do not like performance appraisal. Managers don't like. That isn't to say you won't find somebody that say, "No, I like it," but generally speaking, they don't like them. And I mean, multiple reasons. You don't have enough time to do it justice. One time a year trying to sum up somebody's total like worth of the organization and then minimize it down to a number rating. It feels like you're really diminishing somebody, and that it's woefully inadequate to summarize somebody's yearly performance in a couple paragraphs and a number. You definitely feel like you don't have enough information. Sometimes people that are supervisors, what are called like frontline supervisors, sometimes they work hand in hand, side to side, whatever, with the people they're supervising, and they witness everything they do every day. That in that case, they've got a close view, and maybe they can feel fully informed, and maybe they feel like they have enough information. But it's more common to have your supervisor, and certainly when you have titles like manager. In most organizations, that usually implies a certain level of distance. It usually implies the person's not like observing you all the time. They're somewhere else, and you're interacting with them maybe once a week, in some cases once a month, and they're looking at, and it might not just be your interactions, they might be looking at your work product. They're looking to see if the things you're supposed to do that you hand to other people go smoothly, and nobody complains. But you might not have a lot of interactions with your manager. It's all over the map, from constantly to several times a day to once a week to once a month in terms of organizations. And oftentimes you just don't feel like you've got enough information to properly assess somebody. And then there's not enough payoff. It's like you spend all this effort to try to do a performance management, and you have to spend a bunch of time, and then you go through it, and there's an emotional toll to the whole thing, and you never feel it's fully adequate. And the best you can do is have somebody not mad at you. That's not to say that you give somebody a really good performance rating that they've earned, that they don't feel good. I mean, I certainly have had plenty of positive experiences. But more often than not, you're just trying to make people not mad, and feeling that what they've got is fair. And so there's not enough payoff for both the emotional toll it takes to go through it all, and just the plain tedium of the work. And then employees don't like them. They're dehumanizing, and they can be disengaging. You know your job, and you know whether you did it well or not. And who's this bozo? Who doesn't know, who couldn't do your job. I mean, there's certainly, again, some frontline supervisors that they get promoted because they did the job the best. But I think more often than not, the supervisor isn't the expert, doesn't have the domain knowledge, and certainly the longer they're in a full-time supervisor or management role, even if they came from the working level, they lose that edge, and then they slowly lose the domain knowledge as the domain knowledge evolves, as the markets change, as the products change, as the processes change. So quite often the person doing the work definitely knows way more about how to do the work than the human that's assessing them. And so there's a disconnect there, and it can feel dehumanizing. It can feel unfair. It can feel like, you know, somebody that has power over you, and they barely and at best they have a cartoon version of what you do. And did they see the good or the bad? And so the whole process can be disengaging. And human resources, before you start to think that, oh, this sucks, and it's, you know, it must be human resources that, and all those IO psychologists that force this. Well, human resource managers typically don't like performance appraisal. In fact, in the survey, 90% of the polled HR managers where they were dissatisfied. They felt that the performance appraisal system that their organization used you know, was flawed or inadequate or whatever. They were just, you know, not satisfied with it. And these would be, all of this is lockstep with my work experience at multiple organizations, at multiple levels. Performance management generally sucks. So there you go. Oh, why the hell do we do it? You know, people are still debating about this. You know, does this work? You know, does it work well enough? You know, this is sort of an ongoing thing, and in my career so far, I've seen a lot of evolution of the performance appraisal process. And most of my experience is corporate America, and corporate America has a tendency to, you know, sort of follow trends, and there's definitely been trends over time. But it feels like it's always chasing some hypothetical future state where this is actually effective. That there doesn't seem to be, like, you know, really established, tried and true ways associated with performance appraisal that everybody's like, yeah, that works. This works great. We're never going to change that. So the process is kind of an evolving, sort of moving target, and that's generally because it continues to suck. You know, but here's the rub. Yeah, the performance management sucks. You know, I've said that multiple times here, and I don't like it, and it's not a fun experience overall. But it's better than any alternative that I can think of. I would not want to have a system that is is different than what I've gone through, what I've used. I wouldn't want, like, a more subjective system. I wouldn't want something that all it was me, without any, you know, criteria or whatever, just sort of stating, this is what I think. You know, just giving someone a number with no rationale, not making things goal based, not making things dimensioned in any way. There are arguments, you know, for people to do away with them and to change the rating system to simply good or bad. You know, it's to either we're going to keep you or you need to go. You know, simply it's just a straight bar. If you're above the bar, then we don't need to talk. I don't need to dehumanize you. I don't need to impose my hierarchy upon you as your leader, as a representative of the organization. You're a professional. You're doing good work. You're above the line. You know, proceed, or you're below the line, and we need an intervention and a clear short-term plan to get you above the line, or you need to get out of the organization. So there are some people that advocate for that, and there are organizations that occasionally experiment with that. Just a complete flattening, you're either in or out, and that has its pros and cons. But then it's like if you're a really high driven top performer and you're obsessed with like your rank, you know, you always wanted to know when you got your grade and you got an 86 and you're like, yeah, I got, at least I got an 86, but was it the high, you know, and it bothers you that someone got a 97. Those humans exist. You might be, you may or may not be one of them. But those types of people tend to be pretty damn dissatisfied with like flat things. Because like, hey, you know, I worked really hard, and you're saying I got the same as this person, and you know, we're all going to get what the same raise. You know, this is stupid. So there's really no good alternative. There's pros and cons to how flat it should be versus how many layers on a performance rating. But generally speaking, it's the 5-numbered system that most places use. Anyway, I would not. I don't have a great suggestion for making big improvements. I guess if I had to pick, I would like an option where you could do the normal one, which is your rating of 1 to 5, or you could choose to opt in to the whole above the line or below the line and skip the whole process. You know, do you want to be scored, you know, a 5, 4, 3, or a 2, or do you want the you know, up or down? But if you do up or down, you won't be eligible for the higher raise you could get if you're a top performer. But you'll get to skip a lot of this performative stuff, and that's what I would personally advocate. But I haven't been successful at that advocacy. Anyway. It's an interesting topic. It's something you will definitely experience in your career. Those of you who want to become supervisors and managers and are successful in that regard, you'll be on both sides of this. You'll never not have one, even when you're a leader, because there'll always be somebody. There's always a bigger fish. You know, and even CEOs tend to get a kind of performance management from boards. So there's no escaping some level of oversight in a typical, certainly Western organization. And then if you don't pursue or achieve you know, leadership, and you're a professional at the working level, you're definitely going to go through this, you know, wherever you are, for good or for ill. So just be aware. It's imperfect. People do the best they can. There's a lot of variability because there's a lot of bias. You know, do what you can to accept that where you have to accept it, and do what you can to mitigate it and improve it where you might have that option. So, all right, let's recap. We talked about the challenges of performance appraisal, and we spent several slides going through lots of bias and error with some hopefully not too bad side conversation and squirrel chasing along the way. And then we talked about ways in which you can try to avoid the bias, try to reduce the error. And then we ended it with sort of the bottom line that you know, it's kind of like democracy. It's a it's a terrible system except for all the others, and performance appraisal is, you know, sort of a terrible system except for a lack of it or anything else that's been put forth. So this is definitely an area open for some potential evolution and for some innovation and improvement, and maybe in your career you'll see some interesting evolution to the point where a few decades from now, if you teach a class like this and you're talking about your own experience, you know, you say performance appraisal is awesome, and everybody likes it and it's super effective. All right, so this ends the chapter 6 based lecture, and so we have a bonus lecture in lecture 18, but we're going to continue on this performance theme. But we're going to go back to conversations about complexity and talk about you know, how that plays with performance. We're going to talk about the implicit job, all the things associated with the job that people aren't as sort of explicitly aware of. We're going to talk about how self-narratives play into sort of what you believe of yourself, the sort of the story of yourself. How that influences actually how you behave in the job. We're going to dig into a little bit of what exactly is productivity, and we're going to talk about the phenomenon of comparing yourself to others. And then we're going to end talking about agency and hierarchy. All right, hope this was interesting. Just under the hour, went a little bit longer than I'd hoped. So I chased a couple squirrels. Thanks for indulging me. But hopefully you're listening to this at more than 1x, so it's less than that for you. And we will see you for lecture 18.